Hello and welcome to the second Aussie Potatoes webinar brought to you by Hort Innovation on behalf of Australia's potato growers. I'm Lee Radford, I'm an ABC broadcaster and your webinar host today. And just a little bit about me, I've had over 30 years of experience with the ABC. For about 12 of that, I was the head of ABC Rural, responsible for programs like the Country Hour, Landline, Backroads and a range of other things. And I also love all things rural after spending all of that time in the zone, you might say. Potatoes are right up there. In fact, I put myself through university, fun fact, at the turn of the last century or thereabouts by working in a potato processing factory. You've got to love the mighty Spud. And in fact, that's what my adult son's nickname is. Spud. I couldn't be more in the zone for this seminar. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Jane Watson, who, like many of our audience, is an accredited practicing dietitian. Jane will present the latest science about the not-so-humble spud and resistant starch, which we know is great for gut health. But first, let me tell you about Hort Innovation. As the grower-owned not-for-profit research and development corporation for Australia's horticultural industry, Hort Innovation exists to drive a prosperous and healthy Australia. It does this by providing the best knowledge and solutions to create a world-class horticulture sector. Our Aussie potato growers are committed to growing wholesome produce to feed Australians. And here's a fun fact. Did you know that every whole potato sold in Australia is grown right here in Australia? And I know we've got some potato farmers on board today, so a very, very warm welcome to you. If you're sharing to social media today, please feel free to use the hashtag Aussie Potatoes and to tag us at Aussie Potatoes. We've got a particularly active Instagram community, so if you're not already following us, please do so. Now, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on the Aussie Potatoes website at www.aussiepotatoes.com after we've finished. We'd love to hear your questions, so please use the Q&A function and Jane will address as many questions as we can at the end of her presentation. So now it's time to introduce Dr. Jane Watson. Jane's a highly experienced APD with special interests including paediatric and maternal nutrition, polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS, and disordered eating. She receives referrals from a range of local paediatricians and general practitioners and has been teaching and in research roles at the University of Newcastle. So Jane, a very, very warm welcome to you. Over to you.
Thanks, Lee. And with your strong connections to rural Australia, it's a very fitting place for you to be today with us because, you know, one of the intentions of this series of webinars is to really, communicate nutrition that links farmers with consumers. So, yeah, that connection is really special. Thank you. And also thanks to everyone who's joined us. Thanks to Hort Innovation and Australian potato growers for making this webinar possible. So the focus of the session today is resistant starch. There's been a buzz about resistant starch and its importance for gut health in recent years, but most recently, in the last few months, there's growing interest in the role that it might play with regard to COVID. So the excitement about resistant starch and gut health has, there are various potential health benefits as far as, possibly mental health, immunity, and that's where the resistant starch link with COVID-19 comes in. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see on the clinical trials website in America, Yale University is actually undertaking a trial looking at resistant starch and whether or not increased resistant starch intakes can reduce the severity of COVID through the reduction in inflammation. So, this is a hot topic, and even in light of COVID, which is, to do with lots of the reasons that we're doing these sort of teleconference presentations, that there's a link with resistant starch. This is a bit dry, this slide, but I did want to position resistant starch, I guess, put it in context with regard to fibre more broadly. So there is no single international definition of fibre. In Australia, we use the FSANZ, the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand definition, and there are two aspects of that definition which cover resistant starch. So the first one is that it's not digested in the small intestine, it makes its way to the large intestine where it's fermented. And the other aspect of resistant starch that fits with this fibre definition is that it modulates blood glucose. And that's something that we'll be looking at more closely in the next webinar, so next week. But you can see that fibre has, there are different types of fibre and they have different actions in terms of health benefits. So laxation, effect on our bowel movements, and also reduction in blood cholesterol. Interestingly, the definitions around the world, because they are different, some of them are now beginning to recognise the fermentation by a colonic microflora. So that box on the right-hand side of this slide just takes some of the wording from the European Union Commission definition, which acknowledges the role of gut bacteria with regard to fibre and the links to good health. I think it's easy to kind of think of fibre as just one compound, whereas it's a collection of a whole lot of different compounds which have vastly different action in the body. And that's why we get different health effects with different types of fibre. We also are starting to understand, this is really a lot of the fibre, our understanding of fibre, I think, is still emerging, but we are starting to understand that fibre in whole foods behaves quite differently to the way fibre does in supplements or added fibre in functional foods. The differences between different types of fibre and the way they behave in the body may in some part be due to their different chemical properties. So some fibre dissolves in water, which is why how we classify it as soluble or insoluble fibre. Some fibres fermented in the large intestine by the gut bacteria, and some's not. And some fibre is viscous and others isn't. So I think it's really important to just keep in mind that when we're talking about fibre, it sounds so simple, but there's actually a huge complexity and a lot we still don't understand about fibre and what it does in the body. One thing that is very consistent is the link between fibre intakes and health. So both in the prevention of chronic disease like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but also in the management of conditions like high cholesterol, blood pressure and diabetes through blood glucose management. What's becoming more and more clear is the importance of a diversity of fibre for maintaining a really broad gut bacteria. And there's a linear relationship between fibre, so it's a really neat association. As far as for every 8 grams of fibre that we consume per day extra, there's a significant reduction in our risk of chronic disease. So you can see in that green box that if we add 8 grams of fibre to our daily fibre intake, we reduce our risk of heart disease by 19%, we reduce risk of type 2 diabetes by 15% and colon cancer by 8%. So these are not small studies. That is a meta-analysis and systematic review that covers 185 prospective studies. So hundreds of thousands of participants over long periods of time. So it's very compelling evidence. We know that fibre and good health go hand in hand. I won't dwell on this for too long because most of you are probably very well aware that, females in Australia, the recommendation is 25 grams of fibre and 30 grams for males. The fibre recommendations in Australia are expressed as adequate intakes, and there's no upper level because there doesn't seem to be a problem with having a whole lot more fibre. In fact, some of the African countries have been recorded as eating up to 7 times the fibre intakes that we have in Australia. And also there's a suggested dietary target in Australia for reducing chronic disease risk, which is higher than the adequate intake guide. So in Australia, we we base our recommendations on adequate intakes, but it seems that much higher intakes would probably be a lot more beneficial as far as our overall health. And when we look at fibre intakes in Australia, our daily intakes for both men and women across all ages are not meeting even those adequate intake ranges. So you can see in that graph that men are falling short to a greater extent than women, but both men and women are not meeting requirements, and the majority of Australians, 72%, don't meet adequate intakes for fibre. When we look at the potato contribution to fibre in Australian intakes, it's significant. So we know that fibre is contained in the flesh and the skin, but there's a greater proportion of fibre in the skin, which is why cooking potatoes with the skin on is recommended. But when you look at the foods that contribute fibre to Australian diets, potatoes consistently appear in the top 5 foods. So they are a really important contributor of fibre to Australian diets, and they are, they're available all year round, and they're easy to access, they're very versatile, and I expect that that's part of the reason why, and they're tasty, the part of the reason why they're such an important contributor to Australian diets. So drilling down a little bit more to resistant starch, the estimated intakes in Australia of resistant starch is difficult to estimate, but it seems to be between 3 and 9 grams a day, whereas the recommended intake, although we don't have an official recommendation as such, but the suggested intake for optimal bowel health is 20 grams a day. So you can see we're falling significantly short of what has been suggested as a good intake for resistant starch. And in other countries, I guess tracking with their higher fibre intakes generally, intakes of resistant starch have been estimated at between 30 and 40 grams a day. And again, potatoes are a big player in contributing resistant starch to the diets in Australia, followed by bananas. And between them, potatoes and bananas account for nearly half of our total resistant starch intake in Australia. Another facet of this project has been nutrient testing of potatoes. So 6 varieties of potato were tested, and they were from growing regions all over Australia. They were steamed with the skins on and then cooled at fridge temperature around 4 degrees for 2 hours and tested cold. That method was important for assessing the resistant starch component, which some of you will know and we'll look at in a few slides. But that the total fibre intake of the potatoes tested, and I should just add that a medium potato, I don't know whether you can see these props, but a medium potato is a little bit smaller than a tennis ball. So this potato is 140 grams, which is what the analysis has been done on, and it's roughly the size of a tennis ball or a little bit smaller. So it's not a big potato, and that it packs a punch. So that size potato, based on the nutrient testing done for this project, contributes 7.7 grams of fibre and just over a quarter of our daily intake of fibre. So it's a very high source of fibre. So the graph here just separates insoluble fibre in the blue and soluble fibre in the orange, the resistant starch in the grey. In Australia, when we talk about, or when food labelling reports total fibre intake, or total fibre content, it's the combination of insoluble and soluble fibre. So resistant starch isn't included in that total. When we compare the nutrients that resulted from the testing in this project with Australian data on fibre, including resistant starch, this is what it looks like. So this graph just shows our project data at the top for potato, and then I hope you can see these. The font is a little bit small, but the other items on this graph are other key sources of carbohydrate, so pasta, rice, noodles, bread, barley, chickpeas. The 2 items at the bottom are bananas. So the second from the bottom is green bananas with a resistant starch content that's off the charts. But as you know, we don't actually eat raw green bananas, we eat ripe ones, which is the bottom entry, and they do contribute good amounts of resistant starch. But potato is really impressive when we look at it in comparison to fibre content and resistant starch content of some of the foods in Australia. And based on, there are different methods for assessing resistant starch content, but this data is available on the FSANZ website, and it's all done using the same testing, the same scientific method. This might look like a bad memory of a uni lecture for some of you, but I just wanted to go over this because I think this is really the essence of why potatoes are such a good source of resistant starch. So potato starch is made up of amylose and amylopectin, and the representations of those molecules are on the screen. So you can see amylose is a single chain and the amylopectin is a branch chain. It's the amylose content that determines how much resistant starch is formed. So it's the amylose that becomes resistant starch, and potato starch has a high amount of amylose. It's also highly variable, so it can be between 20 to 43%, but compared to other foods, it's a really high amount of amylose, which is why potatoes convert so well to resistant starch, and that happens when they're cooked and cooled. And just a little bit more detail on that. When potatoes are cooked, and because they have a high quantity of water, that leads to starch gelatinization, which means that the starch in potatoes goes from a relatively indigestible form to a more random form, which is more easily digestible. So this graph just shows that the different types of starch, rapidly digestible starch, which is RDS, the slowly digestible starch, and then resistant starch. So when potatoes are cooked and cooled, we see initially an increase in when they're cooked, we see initially an increase in rapidly digestible starch, and the cooling process results in a reduction of that rapidly digestible starch, an increase in slowly digestible starch, and the formation of resistant starch as those amylose chains crystallise into a form that's not digestible by our pancreatic enzymes. Back to the point about fibre being a range of compounds, this is just to summarise, I guess, some of those the common fibres in foods. And the fibre that I've circled with the orange are the fibres that are in potato, so cellulose, pectin and resistant starch. I think just to highlight that this is an emerging area and our understanding is growing, is that we now have a resistant starch number 5, which is an amylose lipid complex, but it's not something that has been in any of the literature until relatively recently. So, it's a really interesting area, and it's something that's still being understood. This diagram just is to highlight the difference in the way fibre is digested or not when it moves through the gastrointestinal tract. So you can see at the top, if we eat a combination of fibre, and the blue triangle represents soluble fibre, the green represents resistant starch, and the aqua is representing insoluble fibre, that it all moves into the stomach. Not too much happens there. In the small intestine, soluble fibre is absorbed, or the majority of soluble fibre is absorbed. It's resistant starch and insoluble fibre that moves down into the large intestine or the colon, where resistant starch is fermented and the insoluble fibre moves through. What's interesting, in some animal studies, it's suggesting that if the insoluble fibre combined with resistant starch plays a role in moving the resistant starch to the distal end, or the furthest end of the colon, so that the gut bacteria through the whole length of the colon can benefit from the fermentation of resistant starch. And we'll have a look at that a little bit more closely, but it seems really that combination of fibre is really important for gut health for the full length of the gastrointestinal tract. Just as a bit of an aside, all prebiotics can be classified as fibre, and resistant starch is classified as a prebiotic, but not all fibre is prebiotic, because the definition of prebiotics is that they're fermented in the large intestine. And as you can see, if some of the fibre isn't fermented, it goes straight through. But there's a lot of interest in prebiotics because of the possible health benefits. And again, this is pretty early days in terms of understanding the science, but there are some pretty exciting possibilities with regard to the links between fermentation of fibre in the large intestine and health. And the table there just summarises some of the key potential health benefits of prebiotics, including reduced antibiotic-induced diarrhoea, reduced inflammation and symptoms associated with inflammatory bowel disease, and lower risk of cardiovascular disease. This diagram just depicts how resistant starch moves through the GI tract. So starch broadly, other than resistant starch, all other starch is absorbed in the small intestine, and it's the resistant starch that moves through to the large intestine, as we saw in that previous diagram, where it has that prebiotic effect. But most importantly, the gut bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids through the fermentation of resistant starch. And there's a range of short-chain fatty acids produced: propionate, acetate and butyrate. It's butyrate that's causing all the excitement. Propionate and acetate are absorbed and partly metabolised by the liver, and butyrate is important for gut health. So we kind of consider that digestion occurs in the small intestine, and then it's fermentation that occurs in the large intestine, where the gut bacteria get stuck into what's left and what we've not been able to break down through our usual digestive processes. The reason butyrate's particularly important as far as colon health and the colon cells is because it is the primary fuel source for colon cells. And I'm hoping you can see that diagram on the right. It just demonstrates what happens when carbohydrate or resistant starch is broken down by gut bacteria to produce butyrate. And the butyrate then is used to derive energy, which is what's used for the transfer of sodium across into the colon cells. And it's that osmotic gradient of the sodium moving into colon cells which enables the colon to absorb water. So we know that one of the really important roles of the colon is to absorb water. And part of its ability to do that, and a very important part of its ability to absorb water, is the role of fibre and the movement of sodium into the colon cells. So butyrate's really essential for the function of colon cells. The other important action of butyrate is that it helps to form a protective gut barrier. And the next slide shows that. I mean, this is a busy slide, but the main thing I want you to take away from this slide is that if we eat a fibre-rich diet, and that the part of the diagram on the left of that orange dotted line shows a healthy colon wall. So when fibre is broken down and short-chain fatty acids like butyrate are produced, the mucus barrier can be maintained to provide a protection for the colon wall. On the right-hand side of that dashed line shows what happens if we have a fibre-free diet or a very, very low fibre diet. It creates an environment where mucus-degrading bacteria thrive, which breaks down that protective coating on the colon wall and results in barrier dysfunction and intestinal inflammation. So there's an increased understanding of what happens and why fibre seems to be so important in our overall health, and a good part of it is likely to be this the action in the colon and what's going on through that interaction between food and gut bacteria and our colon wall.
I might just jump in very, very quickly, Jane. I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're getting close to the end of the presentation. And if participants are keen to ask questions of you once we do get to the end of it, please do feel free to use the chat function. We're really keen to take your questions, and I know Jane will be very enthusiastic about answering them. Jane.
Thanks, Lee. We're nearly done. So the health benefits of resistant starch, I think, are going to be realised in future years and decades. But for now, we can safely say that it contributes to fibre intake, and we know that fibre intake is so important for overall health. It plays an important role in gut health, and particularly the colon. And it also plays a role in glycemic response, and that will be covered in next week's webinar in a lot more detail. The research that I think will be really exciting in future as well will be the, understanding the links between resistant starch and possibly weight management, cholesterol and blood pressure reduction, and colon cancer. So to make those sorts of links clearly requires large research studies over long periods of time. So it's not possible to make any clear, draw any clear conclusions yet, but I think that will be a really exciting space to watch. As far as the practicalities and, how can we maximise resistant starch in our diets or our eating patterns, here are a few things to keep in mind. So that graph just shows the resistant starch content in baked versus boiled potatoes. So the baked potatoes are represented on the left with the yellowy orange bars, and the boiled potatoes on the right with the purple. It just shows the difference in resistant starch between eating potatoes hot, which is the left-hand bar of both those sets of data, versus eating cooked potatoes that have been cooled and eaten cold. And the final one, cooked potatoes that have been chilled and are then reheated. So you can see that there's resistant starch in all forms of those potatoes, whether or not we eat them hot or cold or reheated. There's resistant starch. There's the greatest amount of resistant starch when they're eaten cold after they've been cooked, but there's also more resistant starch in cooled and then reheated potatoes than there are if we eat them hot. Resistant starch is also highest in baked potatoes, and that seems to be because the cooking temperatures and cooking duration is longer for baked potatoes, but boiled and also fried, whether they're deep or shallow fried, also contain resistant starch. And it seems that the fridge temperature around 4 degrees is particularly effective for the formation of resistant starch compared to keeping them at a kind of a room temperature, 25 degrees. So in summary, there's a growing understanding of the health benefits of resistant starch, and I think some really promising emerging data. Resistant starch intakes are lower than has been suggested for optimal health, and quite a lot lower, less than half of what has been suggested. Potatoes, I think we can, from the data we have for this project, it requires a rethink, really. I think as far as fibre and potatoes, they're a very high source of fibre, and the cooked and chilled varieties or even cooked and reheated are a rich source of resistant starch, and potatoes really are an economical, accessible and versatile source of resistant starch. So that's the end of the slides I have to present. So over to you, Lee, with the questions, if there are any questions that are coming through.
Thank you, Jane, and there sure are questions. It's been a terrific presentation. I've learnt a heck of a lot, I've got to tell you, but I'm feeling very virtuous, Jane, because potatoes have always been a pretty important part of my diet, and obviously an unconscious level, I've been doing the right thing for a very, very long time. So there you go. But yes, look, do have a number of questions already, and just want to encourage those who are participating today to use the function to type out some questions so that I can put those to you, Jane. But the first question I've got here is for people who are cutting potatoes out of their diet to reduce carbohydrates, or even people following low carb diets, what information can we provide about potatoes to people like that?
I guess, and I think there are probably a good proportion of dietitians in our audience, and my first question, or I would want to understand more about why someone is cutting out carbohydrates, given that we know the importance of carbohydrates for general health. They, break down to glucose, which is the only fuel our brain uses. They fuel muscles when we're exercising, and back to fibre. It's like all fibre comes from carbohydrate, and we know that those links with fibre and health are so strong. And also that potatoes provide such a rich source of nutrients. And people might be surprised about how well they fit into healthy eating patterns. They're a whole food, they're available all year round. Most people are reasonably confident with cooking and preparing potatoes. I would definitely say that if people are cutting out potatoes, look more closely at why. And if it's all about calories, I think people might be surprised as well. And what else are they having? Are they having shakes? Are they having milk coffees? Are they having protein bars? What sorts of foods are they substituting? Because when you look at dietary recommendations and nutrient sources of food, potatoes fit the bill beautifully.
And natural foods are always the best, aren't they, Jane? That's a bit of a rule of thumb.
Oh, absolutely, Lee. And the antioxidant or polyphenol content of potatoes is quite high, particularly in pigmented potatoes. And we know that nutrients like antioxidants and fibre behave differently when they're in isolation. So taking a supplement of those sorts of things is less ideal. If it's possible to get it in whole foods, then that's absolutely recommended.
Now, just encouraging those who are on the webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please don't hold back. They are coming in, so I'll keep going with the ones that I've got at the moment for you, Jane. What about sweet potatoes? I must confess, I've never actually been much of a fan of sweet potatoes, but are they as good for you as normal potatoes? What's the comparison?
As far as resistant starch, potatoes don't form resistant starch to the same extent sweet potatoes don't form resistant starch to the same extent as white potatoes. And that's because sweet potatoes contain much less amylose, and it's the amylose portion of the starch that forms resistant starch. So sweet potato have, about half the amylose content that white potatoes have, so they don't tend to be a good source of resistant starch. But in saying that, I think it comes back to that whole food message that it's, sweet potatoes are a whole food. They're high in lots of nutrients, including fibre if you can cook them with the skin on. And eating a variety of fruit and veggies, eating lots of colours, is what's associated with better health. So including a bit of both is ideal, really. That, we don't eat just one food because of the nutrient value of just that single food. Eating is about enjoying a variety of food, and that seems to be as well what's associated with better health.
Okay, well, I better eat more sweet potatoes, I think is the answer to my particular question, Jane. Another one that's just come in, it says, I saw chickpeas on the list of resistant starch sources. Is there a particular way to cook them best to increase resistant starch, Jane?
That's a good question, and I don't know for sure, but I would think that because we eat chickpeas cooked and then either cooled or reheated, that would be, that process in itself would mean that they have resistant starch. They're contributing to our resistant starch intakes. I'm not sure about the different cooking and preparation methods and how that impacts on resistant starch for chickpeas specifically, but I think throwing them in salads cold, it'd be I don't know whether eating them cold versus eating them reheated would have the same sort of pattern of resistant starch content as with potatoes.
Now, what about the way you actually cook potatoes? Does that vary the outcome of what you would expect in relation to all of these various factors that you took us through the presentation, Jane? Does cooking make much of a difference at the end of the day, the way you cook them?
It certainly does, with retaining nutrients generally by keeping the skin on, and steaming or boiling, which we did cover in the first webinar, that steaming and boiling potatoes with the skins on will retain a higher amount of all those good nutrients in potatoes. With regard to resistant starch, there is slightly higher resistant starch in baked potatoes compared to boiled or steamed. But again, I think it comes back to that variety, you know, cooking them in a variety of ways and eating them in a variety of ways, so that we can get the good nutrition of potatoes and have a variety in what we're eating, because different methods lend themselves to the retention of different nutrients, mainly resistant starch. Being baked potatoes, it's higher.
I bet I know the answer to this question already, but I assume, Jane, that you are quite enthusiastic about recommending potatoes as part of a good diet to your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I wouldn't suggest that anyone avoids any whole foods. Nutrition in extremes is problematic regardless of what form it takes. And, you know, the more and more I look at the intricacies of nutrition, the more it comes back to that really simple message of eating a variety of food, as least processed as possible, and enjoying it. Because if we start to become too extreme and, you know, avoid certain food groups, then it's really difficult to meet our nutrient requirements and maintain optimal health.
What sort of feedback do you get from clients about potatoes when you've urged them in the first place to make sure that they're part of their diet, and you've explained, you know, the reasons why that is a good thing? What sort of feedback do you get from clients?
I think people are often really surprised about, I mean, if people are worried about, say, extra kilojoules or calories, I think they're surprised to know that potatoes having such a high water content, I mean, they're 80% water, and such a high fibre content, and they've been found to be the most satiating foods when they're compared to other foods. Potatoes are the number one most filling, satisfying food. But I think people are surprised that how well they fit into a healthy eating pattern, and that some of the extra calories that they're worried about might be coming from all sorts of other foods which they hadn't looked at closely enough. So maybe in drinks or shakes or protein bars or whatever it might be. But yeah, I think once you look at the specifics of potato and align that with individual health goals, they fit really comfortably in a healthy eating pattern for everyone.
And you're never going to get fat eating potatoes, are you? It just doesn't seem like it's possible to me.
There was a man who tried, I can't remember the details of it, but all he ate was potatoes for 2 months or something, and he lost weight. But, you know, again, that's extreme and problematic. But potatoes are very satisfying. And so I think as combined with other foods, so we get a really broad range of nutrients, they're a great high-quality carbohydrate source.
What do you recommend in terms of frequency or quantity of potatoes in the diet?
Well, I mean, each meal and snack really should have a component of carbohydrate because it helps to fuel us through the day. Again, even though I'm passionate about potatoes, I wouldn't suggest that you have them every meal or snack, because it's likely then that you're missing out on other good carbohydrate sources. So in the sense of having a broad variety, I mean, you can have them as often as you like, but, you know, combine them with whole grains at some meals, and you know, brown rice, pasta, barley, other good whole food sources of carbohydrate. But certainly a potato to add into the mix is a really good addition.
I can't resist telling you this is one of those kind of quirky fun facts, but I have a cockatoo, Jane, who has some quirky eating habits, but she absolutely loves potatoes. So mashed potato and baked potato in particular are at the top of the tree as far as the things that she will enjoy. So there you go. It's not just us.
It's very interesting.
How, in terms of the profession more broadly, is everyone really in step with the information that you've relayed to us today, or is there still a little bit of catch up that some need to do? In terms of the potatoes and, you know, and really the benefits of having them in the diet as you've been explaining to us.
Yeah, I think accredited practicing dietitians in Australia would all agree that, well, I can't speak for everyone, can I? But I think generally there would be no objection to the general message that including whole foods, including potatoes, cooking them in healthy ways and combining them with other foods, so you're eating a really broad variety of vegetables, fruits and whole grains, I can't see how there can be opposition to that general message. So, yeah, I think potatoes are part of that message. And as Sue Rad highlighted in one of the interviews on the potatoes website, on the Aussie Potatoes website, potatoes are part of the Mediterranean diet, and that diet is an eating pattern that's been linked with so many health benefits. So, yeah, I think most dietitians in Australia would certainly be on board with the message to eat whole foods and plenty of them.
And let's face it, at the end of the day, Jane, as you pointed out, a locally grown crop, any potato that you eat in Australia that's fresh has been grown in this country. It's a sustainable crop. What's not to like about potatoes?
That's right. There's more than just their good nutrition, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. So look, thanks to everyone for joining us on this Aussie Potatoes webinar today. And Jane, thank you for a fantastic presentation and for being prepared to answer questions afterwards. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and at Facebook at Aussie Potatoes. At the end of this webinar, there's also an opportunity to complete a quick survey. Now, that's only going to take about 3 minutes, so it's not a big ask, about the Aussie Potatoes project and how we can get the best out of this great information to you into the future. Also, please do visit aussiepotatoes.com for resources and evidence-based information. And our next webinar on potatoes and GI is at 11 o'clock daylight saving time. That's East Coast time, next Wednesday, the 7th of October. Please do sign up for that if you haven't already, and we'd love to have you to join us next week when we are on daylight saving time, at least in some parts of the country. You can do this on the website. So look, thank you so much for your company. And Jane, again, thank you for a really engaging presentation today. I'm Lee Radford. Look forward to seeing you next week on Wednesday. Bye for now.